In this news roundup of the week for the 17th of February 2023. As the anniversary of the start of the Ukraine war approaches, both sides are burning through their resources at a rapid rate. The EU's corruption crisis continues to deepen as more MEPs are named in the Qatargate scandal. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is brought down after being damaged by the trans prisoners row. And in this week's Short Thought, how to step back from the modern trend of attacking the opponent, not the argument. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. The UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace sounded warnings about Ukraine's ammunition use this week. Ukrainian troops have been firing as many as 6,000 artillery shells a day, which is a rate that is higher than the West can support, he said. It raised the question just how much the conflict will come down to who can last it out for the longest. So how much has Russia still got in the tank when it comes to chasing its war aims in Ukraine? As the conflict nears its first-year anniversary, opinions remain mixed. On the one hand, Russia continues to exude confidence. Over the last couple of days, it's been carrying out a renewed missile strike against Ukrainian infrastructure using cruise missiles. Ukraine said it believes Russia intends to capture Bakhmut by the anniversary date of the 24th of February. That would require a significantly faster process in the next week than has been seen over recent times. The Wagner Group's Yevgeny Prigozhin recently said that he expected his fighters to encircle Bakhmut by March or April. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Prigozhin's assessments tend to be more realistic and pragmatic than the official Russian cheerleaders. According to NATO intelligence, seen reportedly by the Financial Times, Russia is gathering aircraft near the border, suggesting that fighter jets may be being prepared to support an offensive on the ground. NATO believes that, unlike the tanks, Russia still has 80% of its air power, theoretically enough to overwhelm Ukraine's air defences. Theoretically. Some, such as those writing for the Important Stories website, suggest that Russian forces have not likely adequately trained enough personnel to fully crew those aircraft. And this brings attention to the question of resource above and beyond hardware on the battlefield. How much longer can Russia continue to feed its war machine? With 700,000 Russians estimated to have left the country since the war began, mostly those being the best educated younger men, and with 800 soldiers a day estimated being killed on the battlefield, the question is who is left to make the weapons? So one of the key tank factories in Western Siberia, for example, is reported to be failing to add a planned second production line for T-90 battle tanks because of an acute shortage of personnel. The International Institute for Strategic Studies says that Russia has lost over 2,000 battle tanks in Ukraine and its industry is producing nowhere near enough to replenish those stocks. The Kremlin is highly reliant on a smuggling supply chain for weapons to get around Western sanctions, but that's a costly business. And while it had plenty of resources early on, oil and gas sanctions are now starting to bite. Fossil fuel revenues, boosted by high prices initially, meant that the Russian economy remained in apparent good shape, not shrinking by 10% as had been predicted, rather just contracting by 2.5%. But in the fourth quarter of 2022, that was rapidly changing. State energy revenues plunged by 46%, and the budget swerved into a $25 billion deficit. To fund that deficit, Russia is raiding the National Wealth Fund, which dropped by $38 billion down to $148 billion in January. A burn rate of that scale implies that significantly larger economic consequences for Russian society are not that far away if Russia is determined to keep pumping resource into the battlefield. Putin can't easily sell his oil for premium prices. The West controls 90% of the trade and has imposed a hard price cap. For all that China and India and Turkey might have some sympathy for Putin's regime, they are following self-interest and driving hard bargains for the oil that he wants to sell them. Putin still has some options. He could reduce oil output at the same time as post-COVID China's demand is starting to ramp up. That could push the prices up, hopefully in his mind hitting Europeans again, maybe to the degree where their exasperated citizens would start to turn against their governments. But that's a long shot, not least because whatever else is or isn't going to be a factor with the war in Ukraine, Europe freezing over the winter in the absence of Russian gas doesn't seem to be part of it. A new European Commission assessment seen by Politico suggests that Europe is on course to get through winter with its gas reservoirs more than half full. A couple of months ago, the disruptions to the gas supply engineered by Russia and then cemented solidly in place by whoever blew holes in the Nord Stream pipelines was held to be a moment of big vulnerability for Europe, and hence for European public support, and hence for the stability of a Western alliance. Indeed, various factors have come together in a lucky combination. Part of that has been generally mild weather this winter, and you might say, well, of course, climate change. But you can't take it as read that the effects of climate change come out so benignly. The weakening of the polar vortex can lead, as the US has been finding out this winter, to a major encroachment of Arctic cold air into places that normally don't get often exposed to it. But not for Europe, not this year. Add to that the lucky for Europe problems that China has been having with COVID, leading to multiple lockdowns, meaning that energy consumption there was significantly down. There are other factors less to do with luck. The European action to reduce demand, to improve storage and to source American LNG. Across the EU there have been new floating LNG terminals to take on the additional quantities. That's one less problem for the EU to worry about. So at least that frees them up to focus instead on the apparent corruption in their midst, as the revelations started by Qatargate continue to unfold. So earlier this week, Transparency International published an analysis showing that many MEPs, since the Qatargate scandal erupted, have been belatedly rushing to declare all their various paid-for travel junkets. MEPs are supposed to declare all such events where their expenses were paid for by a third party. They're supposed to do it on a very short timescale, and yet it seems that rule was widely just being ignored. Until Qatargate came along, then suddenly a sudden flurry of declarations were made. The report writers said that this post-scandal surge showed that the EU Parliament was incapable or unwilling to enforce its ethics rules. Meanwhile, two more MEPs, Maria Arena and Alessandra Moretti, were named as being connected to an investigation into charges of corruption and money laundering. They were referenced in a warrant against Italian MEP Andrea Cozzolino, who was arrested last week. One of the accused MEPs, Mark Tarabella, is fighting back. His legal team demanded this week that the lead investigative judge, Michael Clays, recuse himself from the case because of apparent bias, since he, quote, clearly seems to take the contested facts for granted. All of this has been a huge ongoing embarrassment for the EU as it continues to pursue members like Hungary, not to mention global players like China, for their democratic deficiencies. Nationalist leaders have been making the most of the opportunity, not least because it's been the socialist MEPs, the ones that are targeting them the most vociferously, who are most implicated by the scandal. So Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban went as far as calling for the European Parliament to be abolished. European Council President Charles Michel admitted that the scandal was big enough to be dramatic and damaging to the credibility of the European Union. Probably not much helped by the Parliament heads blocking the proposed public questioning of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen about what happened in relation to the Pfizer vaccine contract during the pandemic. Nothing is permitted to happen in public, it seems. There may be an opportunity for a limited behind-closed-doors discussion. Another nail in the coffin for the EU's claims to transparency and integrity, some have argued. None of that has stopped the European Commission from announcing that it's taking Poland to the Court of Justice over the ruling of its constitutional tribunal that the Polish constitution takes precedence over EU law, which is a challenge that goes to the heart of the European political project. If EU laws are not applied equally to all members, they surely and relatively quickly would collapse. None of that stopped Poland and Hungary from ignoring agreed protocol to send ambassadors to receptions in Tehran to celebrate the 44th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. This while Tehran is continuing to suppress with violence the ongoing street protests, seeing demonstrators getting executed for their actions, not to mention supplying drones and other weapons to Russia, which wouldn't especially bother Hungary perhaps, but it's curious that Poland, the biggest Ukrainian champion arguably in Europe, would visibly be there shaking Iranian regime hands in public. Just another reminder, there's always more going on beneath the surface in these situations than meets the eye. Now, when it comes to that question about the energy crisis, there is one more factor that we've not been talking about. Yes, we've seen soaring prices for gas and for oil and problems of all sorts. Now it seems that whatever fuel left-wing leaders run on, at least the female ones, seems to be the hardest hit. Just weeks after Jacinda Ardern announced her resignation saying that she had nothing left in the tank, this week it was the turn of Scottish Nationalist Party leader and First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Immediately after Ardern's declaration, Sturgeon insisted that she still had plenty in that tank. Thank you very much. Well, that was then, but no longer it seems. She has been a combative and polarising figure, that much is agreed on all sides, and acknowledged by herself, in fact. And her many enemies were quick to jump on her recent difficulties with the trans issue as being the major explanation for why she had fallen so abruptly. While only she knows for sure why she's decided to go, there's no doubt that the issue had damaged her politically and, according to polls, had damaged the SNP and indeed the cause of independence by association. The truth is that having tried to get another independence referendum and failed, with all avenues to that having been blocked by the UK government, and having created her own major political setback with an issue where she pushed through a bill that was opposed by a majority of the Scottish people, making the route back to another crack at independence seemed years away at best, and she must have realised that she had lost her best chance. For Sturgeon, for all that she said that issues like health and education were key to her, those services were not rated as having done well in Scotland under her tenure. And all her public focus went to independence and then latterly the trans issue, both issues which she failed to carry. And that's remarkable, given that at the same time as that, she was the dominant election-winning politician in the UK. The SNP, shortly after losing the referendum in 2014 under her leadership, won all but 3 of the Scottish parliamentary seats. She was seen by the public as being broadly one of them. She was an excellent no-nonsense communicator, and she stood apart from all of the Westminster-focused other parties. But every party leader has only a certain period before they reliably lose their touch, and she's certainly been seen to lose it big time in recent months, and that has been reflected in her personal ratings. Now, does this mean that Scottish independence is dead? Maybe. It certainly means it's on the back burner for a while. The new SNP leader, whoever that turns out to be, will struggle to match Sturgeon's popular appeal, given their dominance of the Scottish Parliament and the problems that aren't going away easily. You've got to think there will be some political momentum going back now for Labour and the Scottish Conservatives. Certainly Labour leader Keir Starmer has his eyes on winning back a good number of Scottish seats, which used to be core Labour votes that helped Labour to win UK elections. Accordingly, a number of commentators have been observing that very high-quality candidates are now coming forward for those seats, such as former Minister Douglas Alexander. As far as Labour's concerned, this mini-political earthquake means it's game on for the next general election. It's pretty much taken as read the Conservatives are going to lose. They are so damaged right now, Rishi Sunak seemed unable to retrieve their position from that. And indeed, the Conservative MPs haven't wholly given up their self-indulgences in thinking that maybe they could still get Boris Johnson back in as leader. But it's a much more open question as to whether Labour can win an actual majority. With the SNP sitting on so many of the former Labour seats in Scotland, it's almost, not quite, but almost an impossible task. So you'd end up with a hung parliament and a coalition. But if SNP fortunes are about to go into reverse, which is still a sentence with an if in it, then Labour's ambitions are about to be bolstered. They could still mess that up. I mean, it's noticeable that the Welsh Government, run by Labour, has indicated its interest in following Nicola Sturgeon into the tall grass on the trans issue, apparently unbothered by the political fallout that has been unfolding across the border. And that's a reminder that that issue is something that Labour has also struggled with. But Starmer has been seeking to impose his discipline on the party, clearly convinced that this is his time. So this week it was announced that the party would not select former left-wing leader Jeremy Corbyn to stand on its behalf. Corbyn had the whip removed due to comments that he made in relation to anti-Semitism in the party. This was Starmer indicating clearly to the left and to the left-leaning unions that Labour would not be their vehicle in the way that it had been over the last decade. That might well hold, given that the party's viewing the prospect of government again in hope and expectation. Will it continue to hold years after that victory? Different question. Infighting, after all, used to be Labour's special skill, until the Conservatives decided to compete for that particular crown. However things turn out, the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon will be counted as one of the key influencing factors in the years to come. Like Margaret Thatcher before her, her supporters will point out that she was undefeated in an election of the people. And similarly, her opponents will argue that she was instead defeated by her own obsessions and her own hubris. For me, it's just another confirmation that however brightly someone's political star appears to be shining at any one particular point in the history of a nation, inevitable as rainfall, it is going to end. At least in any country where the opinion polls aren't fixed and the elections are free and fair. Here's an exercise. Think of one of the public figures who you have the most disagreements with. Now list the positive characteristics that person has. If you can't do that, your brain absolutely refuses to admit of the existence of a single good thing attributable to that person, then that's speaking more to you than it is to them. I say this because we're increasingly becoming a society where issues don't get debated, arguments don't get discussed, but instead slogans get exchanged and ad hominem attacks against the person are made against your opponents. This is relevant this week with, indeed, Nicola Sturgeon's resignation. I had no hesitation earlier in describing Sturgeon as one of the most foremost and skilled politicians of our age. She demonstrated it by winning elections outstandingly. She demonstrated it by handling the pandemic as well as any leader did. She demonstrated it by dominating Scottish politics and heavily influencing UK politics for an extended period. And I say all that, although I politically agreed with her on very little. I do not support Scottish independence in the slightest, although if it becomes the settled will of the Scots, then of course it should happen. I think any one-party state, as the SNP has becomes corrupted and arrogant, and there are plenty of signs that's happened to the SNP. She has to take responsibility for some of that. The ability to see the qualities of people that you don't agree with, though, is one of the lost arts we need to recapture. Certainly, I've seen precious few of Sturgeon's opponents giving even an ounce of credit in their gleeful write-ups of her downfall. But it's not even a party politics thing. It's how we discussed the pandemic, ad hominem attacks and slogans. It's how we discussed the war in Ukraine. It's how we discussed climate change. I had someone post a comment recently, a very typical comment, and I just mention it because it was recent, where they directed me towards a video that constituted an extended ad hominem attack against the citizen investigations agency Bellingcat. This consisted of going through the publicly disclosed list of Bellingcat funders and issuing ad hominem attacks against some of the funders as a way of smearing Bellingcat. It's exactly the sort of thing you should reject. Firstly, because you should be aware that Bellingcat have, with their investigations, made powerful enemies. So, of course, some people are going to claim things like they're a front for the FBI or whatever it is that they say. I generally ignore the ad hominems because they're not worth the time they would take. But the point is as well that the investigations made by Bellingcat are evidenced. using open source public tools that can be checked. They focus on what the facts do or don't support. They've done investigations that have demonstrated Russian and Syrian culpability for war crimes, but then others that highlighted American and British culpability, which makes them a pretty unusual FBI front, you would say. For me, I don't support them because I think they're great people. I don't know whether they're great people or good people or bad people. I look at the evidence presented in investigations and see if it stands up. The Bellingcat material so far has always stood up. Doesn't mean you take it for granted that it always will. The things produced by others often don't. Doesn't mean those people are necessarily bad people. I mean, maybe they are. Maybe they just made a mistake. But it means you can have a discussion about what's true based on the evidence. The most recent case on this was the article I referenced last week by Seymour Hersh about the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. I had people tell me that I was stupid not to just believe him, because after all, this was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And I had other people tell me that you should never believe him, because he had a history of being anti-American and he's a crank at best. Now, both of those are arguments about the author of an article, and they have one thing in common. They praise or damn the person. They don't deal at all with the claims that he was making and whether they had evidence supporting them. It came down to another commenter to draw my attention to a piece written by an open source investigator, again, Oliver Alexander. Alexander does not promote a position on the identity of the pipeline saboteur because, like me, he would require some hard evidence to go there. But he did go through the detail in Hersh's article, because Hersh provided a lot of detail and certainty in his piece. And he discussed in similar detail why those details show basic errors in understanding and what's on the ground, errors that you would not expect from an authoritative source, such as Hersh claimed his anonymous correspondent to be. He highlights the inconsistency in comments made about how higher priority secrecy was supposed to be, alongside the fact that the Americans supposedly then worked with Norway on the details, which would be kind of weird. That Hersh made some basic mistakes, like suggesting that NATO head Jens Stoltenberg had worked with the US intelligence service since the Vietnam War. Stoltenberg was just 16 by the end of the Vietnam War, so that seems, shall we say, unlikely. And so it goes on. Errors about the nature of the exercises supposedly used as a cover by the Americans. Errors about how the operation was described and how far away the different explosions were from each other. All details that could be verified independently. Lots of detail, lots of evidence supplied and sourced. I provide a link to the full thing in the video description. None of it was an ad hominem attack on Hersh. None of it presupposed his motives. None of it smeared his reputation. It just said, here's a bunch of detailed claims. Let's have a look at the evidence that will support or refute those claims. As I said last week, two things can be true at once. Hersh could have been making stuff up, and yet it still could be true that America was to blame. It's just that he doesn't know why any more than anyone else does. But if we're interested in truth, we should be able to have that conversation about the evidence without getting caught up with who's a bad person, who's a good person for agreeing or disagreeing with a proposition. Focus on the arguments, focus on the claims. Don't waste time hating on the people making the arguments and the claims, because people can be smeared by innuendo, but verifiable facts speak for themselves. All right, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Without them, this channel could not exist. I would not be able to clear the time to make these videos. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.